Thank you. I'm excited to have the opportunity to share with you my research results related to pesticides. Specifically, I'll be presenting results from research that was conducted at a series of individual projects within Ohio and cross-watershed projects in Indiana, Michigan, and Ohio from 2006 to 2018. All of these projects were part of the USDA Agricultural Research Services Conservation Effect Assessment Project Watershed Assessment Study. And the objective was to document the ecological impact of conservation practices within channelized agricultural headwater streams, and to document the biota habitat relationship within agricultural headwater streams to predict what type of conservation practices have the greatest ecological benefit. These projects were conducted in the St. Joseph River watershed located in northeastern Indiana, south central and south central Michigan, and it was also conducted within the Upper Big Walnut Creek watershed in central Ohio. These slides here to give you an idea of the range of habitat conditions that we sampled in the St. Joseph River watershed and the Upper Big Walnut Creek watershed. We sampled both unchannelized headwater streams in both watersheds and channelized streams. Also, that I consider these ecosystems to be streams. However, my colleague Matt Moore in Oxford, Mississippi, he considers them wetlands. And I have seen in the summertime in the channelized headwater streams, when the water flow stops and the water levels are dropping, these streams are very wetland-like. So in some cases, you may have wetland-like conditions occurring within these streams periodically throughout the year. So in the next section, I'm going to show the result of research for documenting spatial temporal trends in pesticide mixtures and pesticides. The first project addressed the research question, does watershed size, year, and season influence pesticide mixtures? This was a 5-year study conducted within 9 streams within 7 headwater streams. And we sampled both small streams with an average watershed size of 1.3 square kilometers and large headwater streams with an average watershed size of 4.2 square kilometers. We examined 14 different response variables describing pesticide mixtures. And what we found was that only 1 of 14 exhibited a significant stream size effect on a pesticide mixture response variable. However, all 14 of these response variables exhibited a response to either year or season or the interaction of the effective year and season. And what this indicates is that pesticide mixtures in these streams are more strongly influenced by temporal variation than spatial variation. So the example of the type of interaction effect that we found, whether it was a year by season interaction effect, is I'm going to present the result of the percent occurrence of pesticide mixture. In 2007, we saw that the greatest percent occurrence of pesticide mixtures occurred in the summer and the fall and was the least in the early spring. Then in 2008, the greatest percent occurrence of pesticide mixtures occurred in the late spring and was the least in the early spring and the early winter. In 2009, the greatest percent occurrence of pesticide mixtures occurred in the summer and was the least in the early spring and the early winter. In 2010, the greatest percent occurrence of pesticide mixtures occurred in the late spring and was the least in the early spring and the early winter. Then in 2011, there was no significant difference in percentage occurrence of pesticide mixtures among seasons. In the second research project, we addressed the research question, does nutrient and pesticide concentration differ between channelized and unchannelized agricultural headwater streams? We sampled 2 channelized streams and 2 unchannelized headwater streams in the Upper Big Walnut Creek watershed. And these results come from data collected between 2006 and 2008. We found that the average seasonal maximum values of ammonium and nitrate plus nitrate was greater in the channelized stream than the unchannelized headwater stream. We found that there was no difference in the average seasonal maximum values of atrazine and metolachlor between stream types. However, with simazine, we found that the average maximum values in spring of 2006 and 2007, there was no difference between stream types. But then in the spring of 2008, average maximum values of simazine was greater in unchannelized headwater streams than channelized headwater streams. But then in the summer of 2006 and 2007, as well as the summer of 2008, there was no significant difference in the average maximum values of simazine between stream types. So again, we're seeing the temporal variation influencing the concentrations of pesticides. We also calculated a nutrient pesticide toxicity index derived through the concentration addition model and the US EPA drinking water standard, using information from ammonium, nitrate, nitrite, allichlor, atrazine, metolachlor, simazine, and chlorothalonil. We found that the toxicity index was greater, average values were greater in the channelized headwater stream than unchannelized streams. However, if you notice, all the mean values were typically below a reference level of 1, which means they're not attaining the drinking water concentrations equivalent to the drinking water standard. We examined the mean maximum value was also greater in the channelized stream than the unchannelized stream. And the average maximum value was well above the reference level of 1, which indicates that these mixtures are exceeding 1 or more of the drinking water standard concentrations. In the next part, I'm going to present the result of studies evaluating the effects of conservation practices. In the first project, we addressed the question, what is the effect of atrazine reduction practices on pesticide mixtures, and fishes within channelized agricultural headwater streams? This was a 6-year study where we sampled a treatment stream and a control stream. And in the treatment stream, atrazine reduction practices were promoted, and in the control stream, it was not. And this is a before or after sampling design, because we sampled during the period when pesticide management was in place, and then periods when it was not in place in the watershed. And we found that only 3 pesticide-related response variables exhibited a significant effect of pesticide management practices. We found that the mean difference of atrazine death-ethyl concentration was greater during periods with pesticide management than it was with periods without pesticide management. And what we're seeing is mean atrazine death-ethyl concentration was greater in the control stream during the implementation of pesticide management practices. However, once pesticide management practices were implemented, there was no difference in atrazine death-ethyl concentration between the control and the treatment stream. We also found that the mean difference in the number of pesticides was greater in the period with pesticide management than without pesticide management. And what we found here too, that the mean number of pesticides was greater in the control stream than the treatment stream when pesticide management was in place. But then when it was discontinued, the trend became variable. Sometimes it was greater in the control stream, other times it was greater in the treatment stream. And there was no consistent response. Additionally, we found no effects of pesticide management practices on fish biodiversity, abundance, and species composition. The next project, we addressed the research question, what factors have the greatest influence of atrazine concentration in a drinking water reservoir? We had a database from the Hoover Reservoir, which is downstream of the Upper Big Walnut Creek watershed, and that spanned from 1985 to 2006. So here, we're expanding our assessment of atrazine reduction practices from the small headwater stream to the entire watershed scale. And we conducted a multiple regression to determine which of independent variables had the greatest effect on atrazine concentration response variable. And what we found was that 5 of 8 atrazine response variables were most strongly influenced by May to June precipitation. 3 of 8 response variables were most strongly influenced by the percent of the watershed that adopted atrazine reduction practices. Additionally, we found that for those response variables that were most strongly correlated with precipitation, that there was a positive correlation of atrazine response variables with precipitation. And for those response variables that was more strongly correlated with the adoption of atrazine reduction practices, we saw that atrazine concentration decreased with increasing adoption of atrazine reduction practices. In the next project, we evaluated if there's a difference in physical habitat, water chemistry, and the biota between channelized agricultural headwater streams with and without grass filter strips. We sampled 3 streams without filter strips and 3 streams with filter strips in the Upper Big Walnut Creek watershed. We found that riparian width of headwater streams with filter strips was greater than that of headwater streams without filter strips. However, when we looked at the average atrazine concentration, metolachlor concentration, and simazine concentration, I found no difference in herbicide concentration between streams with and without filter strips. Additionally, we found no differences in riparian vegetative structure, geomorphology, in-stream habitat, physicochemical variables, fishes and amphibians between streams with and without grass filter strips. The next part, I'm going to present results related to the biota-habitat relationship within these streams. Our primary research question was, what factors have the greatest influence on the biota in agricultural headwater streams? And this is conducted from a series of studies in the St. Joseph River watershed and the Upper Big Walnut Creek watershed. We found that in-stream habitat had the greatest effect on fish communities and agricultural headwater streams, and had a greater effect on riparian habitat and water chemistry. And we also found the watershed size with the influence in-stream habitat and fish community. And as a result, we concluded that the in-stream habitat was the mechanism through which watershed size influenced the fish community. With creek trout population, we found that creek trout population structure was more strongly correlated with geomorphology and watershed characteristics than it was riparian habitat, in-stream habitat, or water chemistry. With amphibian community, we found that they were most strongly influenced by water chemistry, nutrients, and pesticides than in-stream habitat. But then we examined the relationship of different habitat variables with the frequency and severity of crayfish injuries. And we found that crayfish density had the greatest influence on crayfishing, and less influence than in-stream habitat quality and water quality. So what we're seeing here is that the biota-habitat relationship changes among the taxa, where with fishes, communities and populations, and crayfishes are more strongly influenced by in-stream habitat than water chemistry. But amphibians, on the other hand, are more strongly influenced by nutrients and pesticides than they are physical habitat. And one of the interesting things we're finding among different studies is the relationship of the biota with herbicide and nutrient gradient. We found that amphibian species richness decreased with an increasing acetylchlor and decreasing nitrate and nitrite concentration. And these relationships are occurring at sublethal concentrations of acetylchlor. We also found the invertebrate community index, which is a macroinvertebrate index of biotic integrity, decreased with increasing simazine concentration and decreasing calcium concentration. And here too, we're seeing a response of the biota at sublethal herbicide concentrations. So in conclusion, is that all research involving spatial temporal trends of pesticide and pesticide mixtures. We found that pesticide mixtures exhibit greater spatial variation than, pesticide mixtures exhibited greater temporal variation than spatial variation. We also found that pesticide concentration and the toxicity of nutrient pesticide mixtures differ between channelized and unchannelized strains. Our research results evaluating the effect of conservation practices found that there was no effect of atrazine reduction practices at the small watershed scale when only 30% of the water adopted the practices. We did find the atrazine reduction practices reduces atrazine concentration at the large watershed scale, but the effect of rainfall on atrazine concentration was greater than that of the atrazine reduction practices. And we also found that there was no effect of plant and grass filter strips on pesticide concentration. Our research results involving the biota-habitat relationship. We found that fishes and crayfishes were more strongly influenced by physical habitat, and that amphibians were more strongly influenced by nutrients and pesticides. And we also observed trends in amphibian and macroinvertebrate diversity and abundance occurring below acute and chronic levels of the herbicide. So I feel that these results have some implications for future modeling of pesticide impact on the biota. First, I feel these results indicated a need to go beyond modeling the impact of individual pesticides and model the effect of pesticide mixture. I feel these results indicate that future models need to incorporate annual and seasonal variation into the model. And then the model should also incorporate the effect of stream channelization. And while we did not find much evidence of spatial variation, I would recommend exploring the effect of spatial variation, especially at larger watershed sizes. Also, these results suggest that models should incorporate the effect of nutrients and physical habitat because these factors may alter the observed effect of pesticides on the biota. And also, that these future models should model acute, chronic, and sublethal effect of pesticides on the biota. I'd like to thank the following individuals and institutions for their contributions to this project. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Rocky. So it looks like you've got a sort of a comment from Sarah. Would you wish to respond to that?
Oh, one thing I would say is that the system, you know, like I said, I actually see that as a management challenge because some of the systems are more stream-like and some of the systems are more wetland-like. And if you manage them for wetlands, that can really affect the biota. If you manage them like a stream, that changes up the biota too. But I think the advantage, though, is that these systems have been so modified. If anything we do to improve ecosystem services and diversity is a helpful thing, even if it doesn't fit that narrow regime of the stream, it doesn't necessarily have to if it helps with biodiversity. Third, one question that just popped up the difference between a channelized and an unchannelized stream. Okay, in the Midwest, and the channelization is used throughout the United States. In the Midwest, it's specifically used for agricultural drainage. And so a lot of these small headwater streams have either been channelized, they've been modified for agricultural drainage, or they've been created. Some of these streams were actually swales and wetlands and before that. So it's a combination, and we really don't know which. Again, the unchannelized streams, they've not experienced it. And channelization is typically straightening and widening and enlarging the stream channel. And so unchannelized streams haven't been subjected to this. The more sinuous channelized streams are typically straight. Then the differences between riparian vegetation as well. Question is about the seasonal variation due to storm events. Oh, definitely. I mean, it's storm events, and it's the difference among years, among seasons, but the things are that these storm events influence the timing of the pesticide application. And one of the things I see out in the field is a lot of times I'm pushing to get my sampling done before the rainfall event comes. And guess what? The farmers are out there spraying just before the rainfall event, because they don't want to they're trying to avoid getting the crops in, they don't want to muck up the field in the mud, so they're trying to avoid the wet period. And then question related to the BMPs, one of the things they think, and this is a hypothesis, is that grad filter strips, if they're just thinking, yeah, it works. Well, it hasn't really been evaluated. One hypothesis is that the subsurface tile drains are just bypassing everything. But the other thing, there's so much input coming to these streams. Maybe the systems are just simply overloaded. And another question of, I've wondered myself, how much is being input through surface and how much is being input through subsurface? And that may actually differ among streams. So within the area that I'm working in, almost all the streams have tile drainage, and the farmers rely on it heavily. I have one stream site that did not have tile drainage, and several years into the project, they implemented tile drainage into the site. Unique attribute. Okay, there's a question about unique attributes of the study watershed that could have influenced the result. Okay. Pesticide application, ecology, geomorphology, they are site specific. So I'm sure that, but I think the strength of what we're seeing is that we're not just seeing it in Ohio, we're seeing similar trends in the St. Joseph River, which is in the Lake Erie Basin, and Ohio, and the Upper Big Walnut Creek is in the Ohio River Basin. So I really think perhaps broadening out to a larger regional scale study might help address some of those questions. But I think a lot of it's going to come down to site-specific nature of be it the farming practices, be it the ecosystem, the geology, and that's what makes this exciting. If we knew the answer to this, we wouldn't do research.
All right, Rocky, I think we better wrap it up there. Thank you. Looks like you've got people all excited with lots of questions, so very good.